Hello, everyone in this breakout room. And maybe we can get started with our discussion. It's now 10 to 3.
Hello.
Hello. Hi, Bjorn.
Everybody ran away after the last session, huh?
Yeah, maybe, apparently. It's been a long day. There's Menno. Hello. We've also met before.
Yeah, that's right. At a Citizens Assembly, actually.
Exactly, yeah. The only one that I've ever been at also. Shall we wait for Carrie or shall we just get started with the three?
Carrie is here.
Hello. Yeah.
I'm hiding behind the picture of Hugo Skopek, who is my husband.
Yeah, okay.
So I'm here.
We can hear you, yeah. And not see you. All right, well, welcome to this discussion with Bjorn. Thank you very much, Bjorn, for your contribution. I thought it was very interesting to look at citizens' assemblies in the context of what is the whole process of decision-making and policy-making, and where does it fit in exactly, and what other forms do we have? So would you like to add? Oh, hello. We can also see you now. Would you like to add something to this, or shall we just delve into questions?
I mean, I could easily take off in the wrong direction, so let's just
start with yeah. So, does any of you have a specific question to Bjorn?
Well, actually, I would like to ask a couple of questions, but we'll see. I mean, we do have an hour, right? So it's quite a long time for in-depth discussion.
Yeah.
My name is Menno. I'll first introduce myself briefly. I'm a policy officer at the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Policy. So currently also looking into the option of a Citizens Assembly on climate policy in the Netherlands. One of the things we did lately, because there has been a lot of discussion going on in the Netherlands whether this would be a good idea or not. So what we decided to do was to ask an external committee to like study would this be an option in the context of the Netherlands, and if so, well, how may a Citizens Assembly on climate change look like? So this committee delivered a report recently, which was input for the political elections lately. I mean, in March, there have been national elections in the Netherlands. So currently, this report is one of the main reports on the desk of the people currently discussing the formation of a new cabinet here in the Netherlands. But one of the questions I had was whether it actually has been a good idea to, because with this commission, we made it quite a political thing, like addressing the politicians directly, giving them advice whether to do this or not. But has this actually been a strategic idea to directly ask this to politicians themselves, to decide upon this from a political point of view? Because one of the things I see in, for instance, the UK, is that it's actually quite an external organization setting up this whole Citizens Assembly. So is there any lessons learned from Denmark with regard to, well, is it better to have it like a political or governmental initiative, or is it better to have it like bottom-up or civil-based initiative? What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, I think the crucial part is that there is indeed some kind of connection between the Citizen Assembly and the political system. And I think that connection is probably easier to make if it is indeed a political government initiative, because it sort of triggers, credibility all through society that yes, this is indeed something the government requested. This is indeed something they will take seriously. I mean, of course, you can always discuss whether or not that is the case, but it becomes a little less difficult to discuss when it is indeed initiated by government or parliament. Actually, I don't know how you would distinguish here, but I mean, having it initiated by Parliament, I think would be preferable to being initiated by government.
Okay.
I
What's
forget
the
if I
protocol
answered
here?
all of your question here, Menno.
How do we,
Yeah.
Ellen, how do we make a remark? Do we wait a turn, or how do we have a discussion in our breakout room?
I think with this small group, we can just have a conversation as if we were sitting at a table together. So if you wanted to add something, go ahead.
Okay, I would like to. I just had lunch with a longtime activist here in the Netherlands on climate. And as we discussed how to talk to government and how to talk to politicians, and she's a powerful person in the sphere of climate. She said, I don't trust them, and they don't trust me.
Trust who?
The politicians. The politicians don't trust the activists, and the activists don't trust the politicians. So my partner, who is a communications expert, said, well, you have to change that first. You'll never be able to speak with each other about anything until you can say, what part of this mistrust can I deal with myself, and how do I work around it? So it always comes back to change yourself first. But if it's the government doing something, I like the idea of Parliament. But as much as our governments do for us, there are people well embedded in the climate, and smart people, not just the blessed hearts on the street, but really competent professional people who have a deep-seated mistrust of that. So that's a dremel that we'd have to get over somehow. Where it comes from, how the message is, how the invitation is, whether it comes from the bottom or the top, how to get over that mistrust would be critical.
Yeah, definitely. But might it be, what I'm thinking is that citizen assemblies can also be a tool to create that trust. They can be the tool itself. The process itself should be designed in such a way that the trust increases between everyone present.
Yeah, great point. And there should be exercises for looking at yourself, exercises for how to look at a person across the table who's functionally determined to oppose you, but who could be amenable if you were amenable. So there'd have to be some exercise or some ways around that. But when Menno talked about, the Parliament and the politicians, we need to keep in mind, as much as governments do for us, especially in the Netherlands, there is still a very big, ours hasn't moved fast enough, despite, legal suits and this and that and that. I mean, how much more God himself would have to come out and tell the Dutch government, you must do this, and then they'd counter sue.
Yeah.
They would. So that seems to be the mechanism. Trust has to be built, but the assemblies could be an excellent way to do that if the people had goodwill and could manage their own sadness, distrust, and despair.
Yeah.
With regards to a climate assembly, I mean, there's a number of things that, policymakers can do in order to, establish that trust. I mean, one thing is to spend some time also with politicians, with the political system before telling the public, what kind of promise can we make in terms of dealing with the recommendations coming out of the climate assembly. And here, I mean, as I hope I made clear, I do not think that the bigger the promise, the better. I think clarity is important, and alignment of expectations, because then it will be easier to also tell to NGOs, other climate activists, industry, all the different stakeholders is this is what we expect from this process. Then there's the whole governance structure in terms of having an independent scientific advisory board. So the kind of information that citizens are presented with in the beginning and throughout the process is sanctioned by someone other than government or parliament or the administration, so that everyone will look at the process and say, okay, these are clever people. They might have their personal convictions, but they are, you know, they're specialists in the different fields, and probably the best we have in terms of ensuring balanced information. And then throughout the process, whenever citizens discuss an issue, if they dive into transport, make sure, I mean, I'm personally a fan of small panel debates where there are both presentations and discussions between different stakeholder groups. So green NGOs, the automobile association, something like that. So that they hear these different perspectives and can cross-examine these different witnesses and make up their own recommendations. Those are all, I think, fairly simple and fairly well-established tools you would use for deliberative process, not only citizen assemblies.
In terms of trust, building on what Gary said, are there things you did in Denmark or the organizers from the process did in Denmark, especially regarding trust from the general public in the process of the Citizens Assembly itself, like some procedural rules or safeguarding that everyone's heard in terms of substantive points of view? Were there specific things you did in terms of building trust in the process itself?
Yeah, I mean that independent scientific advisory board was one of those, and I'll say, I mean, when you ask what did you do, I mean, the ministry did something, we did something as an independent provider of the method and the facilitation. One of the things we did was to push for discussion, as many discussions as possible with the climate committee. And here it was quite clear, because early in the process, we already provided some feedback to ongoing legislative work. But they were not interested in that. They were more interested in the process. So they were asking trick questions to the citizens, whether or not they had been manipulated, whether or not they were all just greenies or things like that. So actually they needed, you needed to build trust with them in the process as well. But to the more general public, transparency. So a web page where everything is transparent. But I think the Danish ministry could have done more in terms of communicating that this was there to the wider public, and in a way it's a waste of resources, because it's, I mean, the information there is great. I mean, it would, if more lay citizens saw that, it would greatly enhance, you know, public awareness about the complexity of finding out what policies to install to deal with climate change. I mean, it's still an immature policy field. So, I mean, there's so many trade-offs that haven't found their right positions in Parliament, and I'm guessing it's the same in the Netherlands.
I have a question about something completely different, or, well, it's probably related somehow, but you mentioned in your presentation that there is some kind of second phase possibly to this assembly. What exactly does that look like?
It's become, there is a second phase. It was always supposed to be there. So it's starting now. And it's a combination of physical and online meetings, because we asked them at the end of the first phase if they preferred, only physical meetings, only online, or hybrid. So they prefer hybrid. So it's a combination of a physical meeting weekend first, and then some evening meetings online, and then some more physical.
With all the original participants.
Yes, but also with additions, because we said 100 in the beginning, but it turned out to be, I don't remember, 60 something or so.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So we need to fill up again and get people on board. So there's a process there.
Was the original number 100?
Well, we're trying to reach the 100.
Yeah. Was that the original number? And now you lost some? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And some of them I think we lost because we had to change it from physical meetings to online meetings.
Yeah.
And I think some of them thought, no way. I don't want to do this anymore.
And then what is the goal of this second phase? What's the place
it's to continue making recommendations. At the beginning of the first phase, they identified a number of subtopics they wanted to work on, but they only managed to deal with some of them, and said that others they would like to wait with until a later stage. And part of that decision was also trying to time the recommendations with ongoing climate negotiations, but it's been very difficult also for the ministry to foresee, what is the next step in the climate negotiations. We were fairly quick in also making recommendations for agriculture, but these negotiations are still ongoing, and might be so also by the end of this phase. Nobody knows.
Yeah, because this was just one of the inputs, right, to all these discussions. Yeah. So certainly not near a mandate or anything like that.
Oh. No. And also I'm expecting they will pick up, slightly broader and systemic issues now that they feel more at home and confident in the more traditional sectoral aspect of climate mitigation.
In terms of climate policy itself, like in the more substantive part of the assembly itself, were there, like in the Netherlands, we do have quite a history of different energy and climate policies, right? So there have been several stakeholder-based agreements in terms of reducing emissions or stimulating renewable energy. You also mentioned agriculture, which is a whole different domain in the Netherlands as well, also in terms of contributing to climate change. But there are already quite a lot of measures and agreements in place, which is quite a complex context for a citizens' assembly to work on, because it will be, well, especially for us as a government, of course, very difficult to do something with the outputs of a citizens' assembly if they are interfering with former agreements already made. Like, should we open this whole policy discussion? Shall we open it up again? But then stakeholders may be disagreeing with us or with the Citizens Assembly as a whole. So we do see quite some dilemmas there. Has this been the case in Denmark as well, and how did you deal with it?
If I understand your question correctly, probably no, because the bar has been set so high by the climate law, namely the 70% reduction, that even as this law was agreed, the Prime Minister said, and the Climate Minister said, we don't know how to get there yet. We're making this law without knowing how to get there. So I think there's a tacit agreement and understanding that even if you do make an agreement about, say, agriculture, it is very likely that you will have to renegotiate that 1 year, 2 years after, as you proceed. There's also part of the Danish Climate Act is a review cycle every year. The independent expert climate council will assess to which extent it is likely that the policy measures in place will take us to the target of 70%. And if it is unlikely, the ministry, the Danish minister, has X number of months to respond and say, okay, this is our response to that. How that plays out in practice and who has what power and so on is, you know, political, of course. But at least there's a cycle in place, so there's an understanding that this is an iterative process.
Yeah, that sounds like a very different context from here in the Netherlands.
Yeah, they don't know. It never occurred to us they don't know. If you're an activist, you think they just won't do it because of whatever. Sometimes they just don't know. They must balance, governments must balance enormous economic, budgetary, stakeholder thing, but not to know how to even begin. Never occurs to us. We could be more humble towards them.
And I mean, then you have activists saying that, okay, that's just a bad excuse for not reaching the target. But I mean, it's also part of the Climate Act that it has to, I mean, measures have to be fair and have to take a job situation into consideration. That, you know, it has to be some kind of balanced response that people can see themselves in. So yeah.
Yeah, and what I'm really afraid of is that in this context in the Netherlands, like the stakeholder agreements that have been made will get a lot of pushback from society as soon as they are being implemented, such as like what also happened in France, basically, and what is actually already happening in agriculture, right? With the whole everything around the nitrogen.
Our farmers.
Politics, yeah. And I personally, I think the only solution will be to make sure that we first hear those voices in the process of making these, making our policies, because otherwise we'll always have this pushback. So even if it will not match with the existing stakeholder agreements, is the only way forward.
Nobody feels much fear, really. You know, I don't read the Dutch newspaper. Yeah. I'm starting to see people panicking, but
yeah,
you know, it is a moment for fear, not for panic. But it's a moment to think this country could maybe not exist 300 years from now. We're all moving to Germany. It's that dire. And if you ask people at, you know, Plus Supermarket or Albert Heijn, they don't, that's not part of their awareness. The government could really try to scare people or speak, you know, when's Mark Rutte or the King going to go on TV and say, we're sorry, but this is now over.
And that's basically what Extinction Rebellion is asking for, right?
So they could start that, and then there had to be a mechanism for people to deal with their fear, and you know, the Khameinis have to be written, but there has to be a sense of urgency instilled in people, because otherwise the status quo is too appealing.
But it doesn't seem that our government's going to do that by itself.
No. Yeah, well,
and I'm also very interested in whether a Citizens Assembly will push a government towards this direction then, indeed, because I mean, the conclusions from the, like, for instance, the French Citizens Assembly, of course, they're quite progressive and ambitious, but not really in terms of like promoting people to, well, like be afraid of climate change, or like really, it's more like a story of hope first, and second, it's also quite a concrete package of policy instruments. I think more than 150, rather than some sort of promoting story. Of course, it may enhance like the public debate on climate change. I think that's I think Graham Smith mentioned it also. that there's more like a public awareness level of, well, like this is something like a great transformation of our society and it's going on and we need to talk about it, like something in terms of the way we are speaking about climate change. But the final outcomes of a Citizens Assembly are normally quite balanced. Also, it's not really activist output. So that's also what strikes me about the input of Extinction Rebellion. They do say you need to meet an like almost impossible target, like net zero in 2025, but you need to do it with citizens' assemblies as well. But they're first pushing their own targets and then asking citizens to provide input to how to meet those targets because they don't know it themselves. So that's really interesting.
It is really interesting. Yes.
I don't think the point is that they don't know themselves. The point is that they think it needs to be inclusively done. So they're not the ones.
Yes, of course. Yeah, totally.
Determine. Yeah.
But I think it's
want to prescribe.
I'm guessing part of it is that they expect everyone else to have the same reaction as they have when they face the evidence of scientific evidence of climate change. But here, I think they will probably be a bit disappointed.
Can you explain what you mean, please?
I mean, they have a more of an engineering mindset, because they understand very well, the facts, climate facts, and go to the logical conclusion that you have to do everything you can to avoid that. And they have this expectation that most other citizens would feel the same way and not maybe worry so much about those trade-offs in terms of social bias and jobs and all those other things, because that's where it becomes tricky, also politically. And I think that is where Climate Assembly can help.
Are there any more questions, other topics that we want to cover?
Well, one of the things I was interested in, I think it also relates to this discussion, actually, like more of the content-wise of the climate policy itself. In the Netherlands, well, personally, I do see in the political landscape in the Netherlands that especially like more progressive or left-wing parties are quite interested in the idea of citizens' assemblies in general, but also especially regarding to climate change. But that, which strikes me as a surprise, actually, that more on the right-wing, more populist parties are not really supporting this idea, although it is a means to organize the voice of the people in the policy landscape. Do you see this in Denmark as well? Because it surprised me, actually, because I expected, well, this is something like a means, because they are also like promoting referenda and stuff. So you would expect, actually, from a logical point of view, that they would also support this, but it turns out not to be so. Do you recognize this, and how did you deal with it on a certain way in Denmark?
I mean, actually, the Danish People's Party, which is, some would say xenophobic right-wing party, they are quite in favor of citizen participation and direct democracy, exactly as you would have expected. And so I don't know. I don't know how. Sometimes it seems random, what kind of position parties land in. But I don't know what's the story in the Netherlands.
Yeah, one of them is even called Forum for Democracy. And still, yeah.
Okay, yeah. I mean, that makes you wonder a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, they could at least try, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, apparently, actually, years ago, they reached out to the G1000 and asked them about how the process worked. And when they learned more about it, they didn't like it at all. Like they did. So, yeah. Curious. Yeah.
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 Well, one of the hypotheses I personally have on this is that, of course, as a populist party, it's quite easy to say you know what people actually want without actually knowing it. Like you can say you speak on behalf of the people without speaking on behalf of the people. And when you're actually asking people and they're deliberately informing them rather than using media frames and influencing people, and the story that people are actually coming up with is quite balanced and neutral and not very political. Like it's not politically interesting what runs out of a citizens assembly in general. It's sometimes technical, mostly balanced, a bit boring even. So this quite contradicts the political model of populist parties. That's what I think influences this dynamic, but that's also only like an educated guess, but I'm not really sure what's going on.
Interesting.
Maybe the topic, I mean, maybe the topic climate change. I mean, had it been a different topic, it might have been a different position. I mean, against it, again, it might be a prejudice, slight prejudice also, but right-wing parties and scientific evidence doesn't, you know, always go along that well, and this is especially a crucial thing for the climate discussion, where scientific evidence plays a huge part.
Yeah,
had it been a discussion about immigration or something like that, it might have been different.
Yeah, the Farmers Defence Force, which is the farmers protesting against the environmental regulations here in the Netherlands, is behind the G1000 agriculture that we're trying to organize in the Netherlands. Yeah, they're in favor of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because we talked a lot to them in person, to the person organizing that, like what it really looks like, and then he actually got very enthusiastic about it. Yeah.
Oh, damn, we have to talk to each other.
Yeah, that's great, right?
So what are the odds for the Dutch Parliament or government to initiate a climate assembly, do you think?
Well, Menno,
simply don't know at the moment, I guess.
What is your guess on this, Menno?
It's quite hard to say, actually. I think so, yeah. Well, we do see on the one hand, there's quite a broad political interest in doing something with this. Like the idea, it's very appealing to most politicians. We also did, like I mentioned, the advisory committee we installed, giving advice on how to organize the Citizens Assembly for the Netherlands. This has been initiated by, or actually was a response to a resolution from Parliament. So Parliament asked us, can we do this? We do see this happening all over Europe. Would it also be something with regard to our national context? So then we as a ministry set out to work and installed this advisory committee, which delivered its report. Well, that's on the one hand, we do see like a broad political interest in doing something with this. And well, politicians are really looking for how can we use this, more exploring, like, would this be something for us? And if so, how can we do it correctly? On the other hand, we do see quite a struggle also from politicians themselves. Like, how do we, especially in the policy context I just mentioned, which includes quite a variety already of different laws, different subsidy instruments. How do we fit it in this complex context? And also, what role does it require from us as politicians? So, well, this is quite contradicting one another, and I'm not really sure because currently the negotiations are going on a new cabinet, which is, well, you may call it a political crisis because it's been going on for half a year almost by now. And I don't have any insights in whether this is one of the things that are on the table. I mean, we did recently send a letter to Parliament outlining the most important decisions a new cabinet could make with regard to a Citizens Assembly. So really providing them an input, like, if you want to do this, these are the things you need to look at when negotiating. Also, so what would be the political commitment? What would be the aim of, or the goal of the Citizens Assembly? Like some of these big decisions. Yeah, but I don't have any clue on what's the status of that right now.
No.
It probably depends very much on the outcome of the formation process, right? Like which parties are going to make up our new cabinet.
Listening to what you say, I wonder if there's a conception, a political conception that, you know, the outcomes of a citizen assembly will be very precise recommendations for policy actions, and if that might be the reason why they think that, oh, this is too complex. I mean, how can citizen, you know, draft a legislative text or something? And I think the role here, I mean, there's some split roles and responsibilities here. I mean, there's the citizens who make recommendations, but they're not that precise. And then there's also a role for the ministry in sort of, you know, translating that into what might that means in terms of policy, and for politicians also to reflect upon what might that mean in terms of policy. So even though the legislative landscape is messy, which it always is, I'm sure it will be moving forward. I mean, new laws and decisions have to be made in order to deal with climate change. So I mean, there's still a space for citizens there, even though they don't hit, you know, the precise legal text.
Yeah. It's always possible to fit into the legal context in hindsight, you mean, like with the recommendations that are there, see how they fit into everything else that's going on.
Yeah. And I mean, the further you come along in the process, I mean, probably the more precise the recommendations will be. I mean, if you do this as a continuous process, but in the beginning, it does need translation. So, I mean, recommendations from the first Danish phase lying in the drawer, when the ministry wants to make legislation, take it up, have a look. I mean, what do citizens think about this? Maybe there's a fit, maybe there's not at all. I mean, maybe they just can't match what citizens are saying with preparing that particular law. But in another case, they might be able to do so.
What you're saying is really interesting. There's some background noise here, so I was like hesitate. Okay, it's gone now. I think this more like case by case approach would be very interesting. Like if there, I mean, this Citizens Assembly outputs can be like a very broad package of different things, like covering different sectors and different possible instruments. So it might as well be something that as a government you may have in your back pocket, something where if there is something you need to do, you can always look into it and see, okay, well, so this might be an option, this might be an option. You don't necessarily need to take it all at once or like an integrative package.
No, I wouldn't advocate that. I wouldn't make that a promise to neither citizens nor policymakers or stakeholders. I mean, it's more like, I mean, a deliberative democracy proponents, some of them caution against cherry picking, taking some recommendations and not the others. And they also do that when governments, make expert commissions that make a set of recommendations, and they say, oh, they're cherry picking, they're taking some recommendations, but not all. I think that's perfectly legitimate. I mean, so again, that's a discussion of the role a citizen assembly should have.
And how do you experience in Denmark any disappointment among participants that maybe there will be cherry picking?
Yeah.
Or?
Yeah. I mean, some citizens are disappointed at this as well. I mean, everyone comes with all kinds of expectations for a process like this.
Mm.
So I think it's the role. I mean, the dialogue, the societal dialogue about what role such an assembly should play. The more you can have before it starts, the better. But it will go on as it proceeds, and it will also continue afterwards, because people will not be aligned in terms of what they think should happen. So I mean, that combination of having some recommendations that might suddenly be of use maybe a couple of years after, when the ministry looks at them, and then having maybe some of the recommendations that have immediate political attention and some kind of impact, not necessarily exactly the one citizens were hoping for, but at least pushes, helps to clarify the political positions more speedily.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's really interesting, and I do recognize this more political reluctancy to do this cherry picking, because in the Netherlands we also do have quite a history of, well, we call it polder model, so like really negotiating with all societal stakeholders and actors involved, which we did with a national climate agreement as well. And then the main conclusion always is that it's something like a house of cards, and if you pick one card out, the whole house collapses. So this, I think, is a very important point of view that politicians are also having from this type of engaging with the public. That if you're making agreements, well, being it with citizens or with like societal actors, you cannot at once you cannot go on cherry picking, because then others will also go cherry picking. And if you're making agreements with societal stakeholders, they may say, well, but you're not listening to this advice, so I'm not doing this advice or not following this agreement.
Okay.
And then the whole house of cards collapses, and everyone bails out.
So that's a very different context, right? Yeah. Because it's with stakeholders that have some power to. Yeah. But yeah, because it's like a negotiation, right? Well, the whole setup of a assembly is deliberative and not. There's no trading off of points. Like, okay, if
exactly, that's the. I think really that's also the point of the entrenched interests of Graham Smith he mentioned in his presentation. We do see that in the Netherlands as well, of course, and the main representation of the entrenched interests comes from like this, well, we call it societal middle field, I would say, or something. Well, but more the like representative organizations like consumer representatives and employer representatives, well, all kinds of branch organizations from the automobile industry to energy industries. These are the entrenched interests, but they're very well organized in the whole political landscape. Even, well, there has been a discussion even yesterday or something going on of a former minister changing jobs and becoming a lobbyist for the energy industry. So, well, these connections are very well intertwined, which is, of course, what a citizens assembly would try to break through. But I think in the Netherlands, well, I'm not really sure how that context is in other countries, but I think in the Netherlands especially, these interconnectedness of politics with societal organizations and private lobby organizations is very strong, and it's very hard to go a step further actually. And because one of the things we were also really discussing when we were writing the report of the committee was we are talking a lot about political commitment, but would we also need like commitment from private stakeholders, for instance, if, for instance, the outcomes of a citizens assembly may affect their interest? What if they're saying, well, okay, but this comes from a couple of citizens, but we are not going to do anything with it? How should we deal with that kind of tensions there may arise?
It's actually exactly what the G1000 has been doing on a local level in the last few instantiations of the G1000, to first also get the commitment of other stakeholders and not just government bodies.
I mean, I guess the commitment you can get is to engage as openly as possible in the process. But I think for citizen participation process, it's difficult to sort of make these organizations and politicians sort of put their signature up front that they will do whatever the citizens tell them. And I think that would be the bar would be too high. I mean, it would be too difficult to do what we want to do with these mechanisms, namely introduce a balanced input from citizens in the debate. So I think there has to be acceptance that, you know, of course, these are recommendations. They are not commandments from citizens. There's also, when you talk about all this way you make a consensus or negotiation about results with different societal actors. I mean, there's ongoing discussion in the networks, deliberative democracy networks, about how broad the challenge or the scope of discussion should be in a climate assembly and how narrow. So, I mean, it's also perfectly possible to imagine, you know, a very tight framing of a citizen assembly saying that we are looking at this sector exactly in terms of climate, of a climate law, say within electrical vehicles or something like that, or carbon capture and storage or something like that, and then have a more, you know, have a process where the climate assembly is there. It's not totally control itself of agenda setting, but it's there to interact on equal terms with other interest organizations until legislation is passed. So they have a voice in the process. They can raise recommendations. They can comment on input from others. So I mean, I think that's a perfectly valid option. Others would say that no, that's all wrong. I mean, citizens have to decide on their own agenda themselves, and there's a merit to that. But the risk is also that, you know, they don't hit the political timing well. So I mean, that's also a trade-off there.
May I address a remark to Menno and Ellen here? I don't know if you saw 5 years ago the Agenda 40-point, 40 punten, etc. There's a whole roadmap in there of plans or ideas of how to reduce carbon emissions by farmers, by driving, by houses, by the whole gamut. And they even calculated how much greenhouse gas would be avoided. So there's a roadmap already made by citizens together for our agenda. Have you seen it, Ellen? Have you seen it, Menno?
Not exactly.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
I've heard of other things Urgenda did, but not this particular one.
Try to find, I think it's the 40-point book. It was an actual book, and then there must be something online, but it's staggering the level of detail that all these different groups that we're talking about, farmers and drivers, and came up with at how they could eliminate greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lot already there. Bjorn was talking about. They'd have to start from whatever, you know, cherry picking or picking the topics they wanted. We already have that.
Well, what we actually did in with regard to this was that we went cherry picking actually from this 40-point plan, and some of the measures that are proposed there have already been executed with regard to the national state, as you know, is obliged to address the Urgenda case. And in terms of policy, we did take some of the measures from the 40-point plan into account when making additional national policies, but not all of them. So there are some things. Yeah.
Of course not, but there it was, and you made use of a very valuable resource that came from people. That's the, for you all, that's the benefit. It came from some citizens.
Yeah, and I think it's a nice way. I mean, Urgenda and other public organizations do have a very important role, I think, in mobilizing citizens. Also, apart from state actors, which you mentioned rightfully, may also trigger like distrust from people, whereas more civil organizations may have a higher level of trust from the public. So I think some kind of broker in that sense is very important. So, well, I do see that this type of organization does have a very important role to play in the public debate as a whole, but also in citizens assemblies especially, which is like a concern for me, is whether like Urgenda is like it's an activist organization based on promoting climate change policy. So if you're looking to broaden your actual scope for, well, also trying to involve, for instance, people who are not afraid of climate change or don't even believe in climate change, you're missing out these people because Urgenda wouldn't reach them. Or they would naturally have like distrust in organizations as Urgenda because they fear that it's funded by some kind of activists or funded by left-wing political parties or whatsoever. So how to engage with this whole broad public rather than like a more smaller representative part of the public is quite difficult. I think Graham also mentioned rightfully the notion of diversity of perspectives. And I think Urgenda and also the constituency of Urgenda is one of the perspectives, but there's also quite a lot of different other perspectives you need to take into account. And that's the difficult thing, I think.
Yeah. Take Urgenda's name off the report and take the recommendations.
Well, I think the problem we have with climate is not one of lack of solutions.
Well, these are calculated to the tons of greenhouse gas.
Yeah, that's great.
You've got all the parties except politicians in there. You got many stakeholder groups represented. So when Menno says, "Oh, that's just Urgenda," you didn't say that, but these are people who themselves wanted to provide solutions based on what they're doing, and often this is already being done by them. Just get the book and take a look. You don't have to subscribe to Urgenda's whatever, but it was a stunning amount of work that they put out.
Are there any last questions left that we want to ask Björn? Now that we have, I think, 6 more minutes.
Well, perhaps one final thing you mentioned in your presentation is that you're also looking at more like taking the Citizens Assembly a step further and institutionalizing this kind of work. How is that going? Just like a general question. And what are like obstacles you're running into?
I mean, it is a discussion. I would say it's a discussion that has been actually started at the beginning. of the Danish Climate Assembly. I mean, so everyone is aware that, you know, that is a reflection that has to be made now at the end of the second phase. A decision has to be made whether or not to continue that. So researchers have studied this and are starting to coming out with recommendations for how to do it in practice. It's a small discussion among politicians, a bigger one among civil society organizations. I wouldn't say the odds are very good, but it is an ongoing discussion about should we continue this climate assembly as part of the Climate Act for the next, I think, 8 years leading up to 2030, when our target has to be met. So I think there are good arguments for doing it, but in what format exactly, and then all these technical discussions start. You know, should you change the composition of the citizens? Do they become experts? But those are, I think, more of a practical nature, you know, and finding an agreement about maybe exchanging 1/3 of them every year or something like that.
So this is the question of continuing the Citizens Assembly about climate specifically, this particular topic, and not necessarily doing a yearly assembly on some topic, like institutionalizing it as part of the democracy in general.
Yeah, I'm guessing, you know, a potential format would be to have it in this during the running of the Climate Act.
Yeah.
So a semi-permanent institution, and then figure out, you know, okay, is that it, or probably by then there's another citizen participation method in fashion, you know, flushing all over Europe, and everyone thinks this is the magic tool. Yeah. So yeah.
Wow.
Thank you. Very interesting. I mean, in the Netherlands, we do need to get started, but this would be like a very interesting next step or something. We do have a National Climate Act as well, which also demands the government to have at least, like, we do need to make once in the 5 years, I think, a climate action plan.
Yeah.
Oh, we do have. Which also demands from the government that there is a public consultation on the climate action plan. So this is already like a mechanism built into the Climate Act.
Yeah, coming from the UN agreement, I guess. I mean, the NDCs or.
So they need to be linked, and it's actually coupled to the European mechanism of the NECPs. If you're technically informed of the climate change, so it's linked to the NECP cycle, which is linked to the global cycle.
Yeah.
But well, we may also build on that with broadening this public consultation towards having a citizens assembly on each climate act or climate action plan. So there is a linkage, but I'm really interested if there's a political will to make that linkage actually.
Yeah, I think linking it to those action plans would be a very nice, you know, hook, policy hook. And I guess if it's a permanent thing, you know, it goes on for 5 years. In the meantime, there would be enough time to make recommendations for bits of legislation that would be national, and then sort of have a bigger look at the whole package when you're getting closer to the 5-year deadline. That would make a lot of good sense.
In a bit, we'll be thrown out of this room in a couple seconds. So thank you all very much. It's nice that we had like a small amount of people and could have a really in-depth discussion. So
very nice.
Really
Thank you.
interesting.
Nice to meet you all.
Yeah, thanks. Nice to meet you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.